If you've ever taken your girlfriend or wife out shooting and she got some brass on her shirt, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you've ever taken her out shooting and she's hardcore outshot you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button as well. Like, comment, do all those things. You know them. They help me out quite a bit. I have shirts, belts, all that kind of crap. Buy them. They support me quite a bit. They support this channel directly. Hey, I'm not asking for free donations. I am actually producing stuff. There are a lot of different optics out there on the market right now to mount to your pistol. Now, two of those have kind of ended up being the main contenders, that being TRIJICON RMR and the Leupold DeltaPoint. I have my TRIJICON RMR on the Trident Defense Glock 19, and then I have my DeltaPoint Pro on a Glock MOS that was modified by Lander's weapon systems, including the frame. Both of these are really excellent custom guns, and we'll be doing a video on both of them very shortly here. My other slide that I have right here was a custom milled one by a small company that went out of business. I'd recommend ATEI or something along those lines for milling for this type of work. I've had the chance over the last year or so and a couple months to try out both the TRIJICON RMR versus the Leupold DeltaPoint. Now, there are, of course, other optics out there that I'm sure are comparable, but I don't have a whole lot of trigger time on them. I feel like I'm more qualified to talk about the TRIJICON versus the Leupold DeltaPoint. So we're going to go ahead and launch into it. So without getting too long-winded, let's get down to it. The TRIJICON RMR is smaller than the Leupold DeltaPoint overall. Now, by how much? Not a whole lot, but it's shorter in length. It's a little bit shorter as far as height is concerned. Regarding the width, they're about similar. Now, the Leupold is a little bit narrower at the very base, but it flares out in the window, so it kind of about equals out overall. Now, with how tall the Leupold is, it's hard to find sights that are going to work correctly. So you have to get extra tall sights. This can present some holster compatibility issues. Now, I've found, however, that with the window being so open, that it ends up that I actually don't need those iron sights to find that dot. And that's in stark contrast to the TRIJICON RMR, where I definitely need those iron sights to find that dot. The Leupold DeltaPoint also has a little notch at the back to allow you to install their own little iron sight right there. That way you can co-witness through the window. I do think it's a good idea to have iron sights that you can see through the window. That way if your weapon goes down, you're going to be able to use it, especially on a duty weapon. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point out that because the window is so big and good on the DeltaPoint Pro, I don't specifically need those co-witness iron sights. With the Leupold being taller, it also has a much larger window, so that's the first thing I want to talk about. The Leupold DeltaPoint has a much larger window than the TRIJICON RMR, and it might not seem like a whole lot when you're just kind of looking straight down the lens on these two, but when you're actually bringing this up to bear on target, it's very apparent. And I found that personally, because of that, I find that target acquisition, or specifically finding the dot with the Leupold DeltaPoint, is much easier. It's for that reason that I typically prefer it for a lot of applications. Now, I'm not saying this is my favorite. I'm just kind of noting a couple things right now. Regarding the glass, the Leupold DeltaPoint has very, very clear glass, like ridiculously clear. Looking through it, you can hardly tell there's any tint at all. Now, compare that to the TRIJICON RMR, and there is definitely a bluish tint to these optics, and that's to help with reflectivity of the dot and that type of thing. And I'm sure it helps with battery life, because the TRIJICON RMR does have a much longer battery life than the Leupold DeltaPoint. Now, there's been a lot of discussions about the DeltaPoint and its battery life and how good or bad it is. So let's kind of get down to numbers here. So with the RMR, I found that a battery typically lasts me around a year, maybe a year plus, depending on the brightness settings that it's at, how long it's at those brightness settings, and all that type of thing. But they last quite a while. Another thing to note is that with the TRIJICON RMRs, that some people have a problem with the dot flickering. And this is because the battery isn't making constant contact because it's getting battered around in there. So to fix this, what you need to do is you can bend that battery contact out a little bit, and then you can use a battery that is the correct size that will kind of help it from flickering. So that battery is going to be a Sony. The Sony batteries work very well in the TRIJICON RMRs, and when I've switched over my RMRs to those Sony batteries, I've typically have had no problems. But your mileage may vary. On the Leupold DeltaPoint, it's usually lasting me around, I'm going to say, depending on the brightness setting that it's at and how often it's carried and all that type of thing, around 2 to 8 months, depending. So that sounds pretty abysmal compared to the TRIJICON RMR. And yeah, it's definitely shorter. But the one thing about it is that when you change the battery on the TRIJICON RMR, you have to unscrew it, get it off the pistol itself, because the battery is underneath, and the only way to get to it is by unscrewing the optic. It's kind of a pain in the butt. Compared to the Leupold, you simply hit this little thing out and it pops the battery straight out, then you're good to go. It's very simple to use and very simple to change the battery on. I just did it. Good times. So I love how easy it is to change the battery in the Leupold, because with the TRIJICON RMR, I have to re-zero the optic, all that type of stuff. It's just kind of a pain. One thing that helps with the battery life on the Leupold DeltaPoint is that it has an auto shut-off feature. So after a certain amount of time, I want to say about 15 minutes, the dot will shut down. Now it's motion activated, so anytime there's any type of movement, it's going to turn right on. Now some people might be concerned, like, hey, if I'm drawing from a holster, is it going to be quick enough to turn on in time? Well, here's the thing, like any motion at all is going to turn it on. So if it's sitting in your holster, that movement of you moving around and walking around, that thing's on no matter what. If you're grabbing this out of your safe, like that safe just jiggling a little bit is enough to turn that Leupold DeltaPoint on. So it's on immediately. I've never been able to outpace it, and I would be extremely surprised if anybody could. It's very fast. Regarding zeroing the optics on both of these, because that is kind of a topic I want to talk about. On the RMR, I've never had trouble with the knobs as far as feeling when I'm clicking and all that kind of stuff. But I do find that on the Leupold that it feels a lot more positive. That's not to say that the TRIJICON RMR is bad. I just feel like the Leupold DeltaPoint Pro is a little bit more refined when you're kind of making those adjustments. So just something I wanted to note there. Now, one thing though, is that with the Leupold, because it is so tall, it's not quite as natural to bring it onto target. So although it's easier for me to find that dot, I find that I'm having to kind of slightly change the way I'm angling my hands and all that type of stuff to get that dot on the target. And that does have something to do with the fact that I have this mounted on the Glock MOS, which usually rides those mounts a little bit higher than what you typically see. I do want to get this specifically milled out for a DeltaPoint, but even still, it's something to note that it's just going to sit a little bit taller than the TRIJICON RMR. The lower those optics are onto your pistol, the kind of the more natural it is to bring it into your point of view. The RMRs do sit pretty flush. There are, of course, the lower ones. There's the Shield RMS, which sits very low. I haven't had a chance to try those out yet, so I can't comment too much on them. But the point is that the lower those are to the slide, kind of the easier that is for you to bring it on target overall. Changing the brightness settings. So there's a couple different models for the TRIJICON RMR and for the Leupold DeltaPoint. So on this particular Leupold DeltaPoint, I'm using the 2.5 MOA dot. That's what I prefer. On the RMR, I use the 3.25 MOA dot, and there's two types. You have the adjustable, where you adjust the brightness yourself, and then you have the auto. You think that the auto would be better, but the technology is not quite there. So it works in most situations, but say I'm in a dark room and I'm aiming into bright sunlight, it doesn't work very well, and the dot often gets washed out because it's not bright enough. So I prefer to have manual adjustment. So the DeltaPoint Pro and this particular RMR model, which is the RMR model, which is the RMO6, allows me to manually adjust. Now, the TRIJICON RMR is much easier to adjust. There's a negative on one side and a positive on the other side. Positive makes it brighter, negative makes it a little dimmer. Easy. Compare that to the DeltaPoint. There's one button in the center. So it's either going to go one way or another. So once I hit the top, it's going to flash a couple times. And if I keep pressing that button, then it will go all the way down to the lowest setting, and then it'll flash a couple times. And if I keep pressing it, then it'll go all the way back up. So it's not very precise. I wish they would have a different way of changing the brightness settings, maybe something a little bit more similar to the TRIJICON RMR. Maybe they'll do that in the future. But it should be noted that the reason that matters is because if you're concealed carrying, it's a lot easier to adjust the intensity of the dot on my RMR than it is on my DeltaPoint Pro. Now, I kind of justify that in the fact that I usually keep this pretty bright, about maybe one setting below the brightest setting, because when I'm bringing my weapon up, I'm almost always turning that light on and engaging. So with that dot nice and bright, it usually shows up fine with the weapon light. But that's me kind of gaming the system a little bit. There's no doubt that the RMR has a better system. As far as the dot size goes, 2.5 versus 3.25 on the TRIJICON RMR, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Sure, the DeltaPoint Pro has a smaller dot, and you might say, hey, that's probably more precise, but for the shooting that I've done, I haven't really noticed any difference between the dot sizes. Maybe my eyes aren't good enough for that, but I'd be surprised if you could really notice. Regarding shooting under night vision, shooting a pistol that is equipped with an optic under night vision makes your life a whole lot easier. The dot's really easy to see. So I went ahead and I tested all these optics against each other under night vision. Now what I found was that the TRIJICON RMRs were overall a lot better, and that was due to the fact that the brightness on them worked a lot better with night vision. So on the auto-adjustable RMR, so the RMO2 that just does it on its own, you can see under night vision it looks pretty good. It's at a correct brightness adjustment, maybe perhaps a little bit bright. Now we can take the RMO6, which is the manually adjustable one, and again you can see that I can dial the brightness to where I want it, and it's very effective under night vision technology. Now, when we use the Leupold DeltaPoint Pro, you can see that it's way too bright. That's a no-go. It's just not going to work. It's going to obscure my target, all that kind of stuff, so it's not going to work. Now, another thing that I wanted to look at was as far as being able to see the dot when I'm looking at the pistol. So, for example, if an adversary has night vision technologies or capabilities or something like that, how it would look. And with the RMRs, you couldn't see anything, but with the DeltaPoint, you could see, I know I'm kind of close to the optic, but you can definitely see the LED shining into the window. So if that's a concern for you, something to think about. Some final thoughts for you guys. Thoughts. The Leupold DeltaPoint Pro. Big window, very little distortion, edge-to-edge clarity. For me, subjectively, easier to shoot through, and I find that I have faster times with the DeltaPoint Pro. Easy to swap out batteries. Cons. It's higher. Because it's higher, I have to cant my wrist just a little bit more, kind of have a different kind of shooting grip versus the TRIJICON RMR. Also, it burns through batteries a little bit faster. At the same time, easier to change the batteries. So, kind of so-so. It's hard to change the settings as far as the brightness. And then finally, if you're shooting under NVGs, probably not your best option. So figure out what you do and if the DeltaPoint Pro works for you. Compare that to the TRIJICON RMR. It's easy to control the brightness settings. It sits low on the gun, makes it more natural for me to aim and fire. Now cons, for me personally, I think it's easier to fire through the DeltaPoint Pro. Is that really, me being subjective? No, you can definitely train through that and be just as good with the TRIJICON RMR, like Lucas of T-Rex Arms, who is a complete beast with one of these. If you're also shooting under NVGs, this is probably your better option. Now cons, of course, if you need to swap out the battery, you need to unscrew the entire RMR, swap it out, and then put it back on. So if you're a type of guy who obsesses with having a fresh battery every time you run a mission, this probably isn't the optic for you. But that being said, the batteries do last a long time. Point is, guys, these two optics kind of fill slightly different roles. Figure out if the optic's going to work for you or not work for you based on what you do and go from there. Ultimately, guys, what it comes down to is looking cool. Both optics look pretty cool, so get both and go ahead and John Woo that thing up.